QuickBooks Online 2025 Comparative Balance Sheet Creation. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. Here we are online in our browser searching for that QuickBooks Online test drive, the free sample company file available to everybody. Looking for the result that has Intuit.com in the URL because Intuit is the owner of QuickBooks. This is the one we want here. And we're then going to choose the United States version of the software, verify that we're not a robot if needed, and then we're going to tab to the left and close that one up because it's not needed any longer. We're going to be in the sample company file, Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. Then we'll open the major financial statement reports because that's the process that we do every time. In the reports, in the standards tab, favorites, we're going to right-click on the balance sheet and open a link in a new tab. Right-click the profit and loss, open a link in a new tab. Let's go to that balance sheet report. I'm going to close up the hamburger. We will change the range. We've been going to a 2-year time frame, so we'll continue with that. 010124 tab, 123125 tab. Selecting the drop down to see it in years, running it to refresh it. We now have 2024 and 25 side by side. Let's tab to the right and do the same thing. Closing the ham boogie, changing the range, 2-year frame, 010124 tab, 123125. We want to see it in years, run it to refresh it, and noting that QuickBooks is currently putting more information in 2025 as they refresh their sample company file. So you're going to need to decide when you're watching this, where does QuickBooks currently have its sample data in to use it as your major reference point, shifting from 24 to 25. Now, we're going to use these two financial statements as kind of our baseline financial statements. Let's open up another financial statement that we will then adjust for the balance sheet, making a comparative balance sheet statement. Back to the first tab to do so. Now, I'm going to close up the hamburger here, and I just want to point out that when we went down to the overview, as we did in a prior course or section, we saw that we have some comparative balance sheets, a balance sheet comparison here, for example, and that is a type of comparative report that we can generally make by ourselves, which you would like to be able to do because that gives you a lot more flexibility about the types of comparisons that we can make. And note that once you start thinking about the kinds of comparisons you can make, in essence, an infinite amount of comparative reports, right? Because you could say, okay, I'm going to compare this period to the prior period, or I'm going to compare this month to last month, or this week to that last week, or I'm going to run a report that has all 12 months, or possibly 3 months or 2 months. So what we then need to do is not be overwhelmed by the number of comparisons that we have, deciding when we want to run comparative reports, in particular when we're giving those reports to external users, such as clients and possibly supervisors, depending on our situation, so that we're maximizing, the benefit without getting overwhelmed or bogged down with too much information. All right, let's go back up top. I'm just going to right-click on that balance sheet again, open a link in a new tab again, and let's go on over to the tab to the right. And I'll close up the hamburger. Now, I currently have most of the data, I believe, still in 2024, and then they've started adding data in 2025 as we are in the beginning or the starting of the year of 05. So let's try to make this data for just 1 year purposes of 2025, 010125 to 123125 as our default, and then I'm just going to run that. So that's going to be basically our baseline. Here is once again our standard balance sheet, which is ran as of a point in time. Now, if we want to do a comparative report, then we're going to have to want multiple periods, and there's multiple ways we can do multiple period reports. Noting that you might want either just 2 periods as a comparison, like we've been doing, comparing just last year and this year, or you might want more than 2 periods. For example, you might want months so that you have 3 months in a quarter, 12 months in a year, or you might run it in quarters. So that means that you're going to have more than just 2 columns. Now, if you are just comparing two things, two columns, you have a further choice of, do we want to subtract the two columns, taking the difference between the two columns, and then possibly also having a percentage calculation looking at the percentage change from one period to another. We also have the question of, if we have two columns representing two periods, do we want to have the older period up front and then the new periods on the right, which is the way we would possibly first think about aligning the data, reading from left to right, older to newer. But it also makes more sense sometimes to put the more current period on the left, because then you're going to be reading it first if you're reading from left to right, and then have the less relevant and older data to the right. So those are some choices that we have. Now, what we have been doing whenever we set up the company file is we've been choosing a 2-year time frame and then selecting years in the dropdown. When we do it that way, it will typically create two periods, and it's going to put the older one up front. In this case, let's do a similar process just to see that comparison, but we have 1 year's worth of data this time. So if I select this dropdown, which is located here, remember that if you're in the switch to modern mode, just to take a look at it, what it looks like in the modern mode, you have then the display, and then here's going to be your display columns. And then you have the further drop down here under the dates, where you have the day, month, quarter, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go back to the classic mode for now. Just note that you can use either of those. I'm going to switch back to classic. We still don't really know where QuickBooks will land as they A/B test these different formats of the screen, but the functionality in essence is the same. It's just the look and the feel of it. So we might, if I choose a whole year, I then might say, well, I want to see it in terms of months, and then I'm going to run it to refresh it. And so now it's given me a whole lot of data. Now, because this is a balance sheet reports, and balance sheet reports report as of a point in time, it's going to give us each of these months, but basically report as of the end of the month. So here's where our data was, in other words, at January 31st, 2025. February 28th or 29th, 2025, March 31st, 2025, and so on. Let's also this time take a look at it in quarters, which will be a little bit easier to see, and run that to refresh it. So now notice you only have 4 quarters, which are running 3-month time periods. So although this says January through March for the quarter, it's really just reporting as of the end of the period, the end of March, the end of the quarter. Whereas if I go to the income statement, you will recall if I run this by quarter, for example, and run that, then it's going to give me the quarter information. I have a 2-year time frame up top instead of a 1 year, but notice it's given me the quarters which represent the activity for a particular quarter, meaning the beginning to the end of the quarter, and it gives me a total column because it's totaling everything up for this 2-year frame. We don't get this total column when we're on a balance sheet type of report because it doesn't make sense to sum up the columns in that case. So that's just something to keep in mind. We'll get to the income statement reports running similar reports in future presentations. So that's one way that we can do it. It's reporting when we do it this way from the oldest to the newest, and we can have more than one column. So we don't just have 2 comparative points, but more than 2 comparative points. What I can't do, however, is subtract the 2 very easily. I can't basically say this is one column minus the other because there's more than 2 comparative columns. So what we can do then, if I want to make a comparative type of statement is, and this is where we have to kind of think of how QuickBooks works. If I want to compare, say, 2025 to 2024, I'm not going to set the date range from 2024 to 2025. I could, if I did that, notice what would happen. 2024 to 2025, and then I could set this to years, and it would give me the 2-column comparison, the older period first, and then the latter period. But what if I want 2025 first, and then 2024, and then I want to take the difference between the 2 and possibly then a percentage change column? Well, then I don't want to run for the 2-year time frame, but I want to run for the latest period, which is going to be 01/01/25 to 12/31/25. I want to see it in totals. I'm not going to switch this column. That's not how I'm going to do my comparative report this way. If I want to make a difference column, I'm going to run it. So now I'm back to just one column. And then we're going to go into the drop down, not that one, this one. And this is this is the old view, the classic view, where it has the previous period. So the previous period in custom periods is going to be 1, 2. Now notice it changed it a little bit because of possibly the difference in the number of days in each year. So we want to make it possibly a full year. And if it was a full year, I could go down to here, right? So the previous year, which will give us the previous year, or I can custom put in the period, which will most likely be a previous year. In our case, it might be easier to do this one and then run it, remembering that I'm going to switch it back to the modern mode just so we get an idea of where these things are located. So if I go into the compare thing in the modern mode, now I'm comparing to the previous year here, and then we've got our calculations, which is the dollar change, the percentage change, and so on and so forth. All right, let's go back to the classic mode. And so there is our comparison. So now we have the balance sheet as of December 31st, 2025. Notice that this subdate is a little bit off, or it may not be something we want to keep. We might want to remove it now because we now have 2 periods as of the end of 2025 and in the prior year, 2024. And there we have it. Now notice it's also a little bit harder for us to change these headers. Maybe I don't want it to say prior year here. Maybe I just want it to say 2024. If we export this report to Excel, we can do a little bit of more of that customized formatting to it as well. Although again, remember that you would have to do that in essence every time if you were to export and do more formatting in Excel every time you generate the report. If I hit the drop down again, then I can do a comparison for a change in dollar amount, which is quite common. So I could run that. So now I have the difference between the two. Because there's only 2 columns, that allows me to run the difference. Again, if I was in the switch to modern mode, where would that be located? It would be in the compare area. I did the prior year, and then in the drop down, now we have the dollar change. All right, let's close that back out and let's go back to the classic mode just so we see both of them. Then if I select the drop down, I can also do the percentage change, and then I will run it again. And so now we have the percentage change. Now the percent change, by the way, if I go to the switch to the modern mode, that would be under the comparisons. And now we have this one up here and then the drop down, which has the dollar change and the percent change, which is a little bit more efficient of a layout than we have in the classic mode, but you could see the comparison between the two. Let's go back to the classic mode. Let's see how is that change calculated. This is a common thing that we want to basically know how to do, a change period over period. Notice that we have the current period up front. So if I'm looking at this comparison on this top line, it would be 1201 minus the 2042.32 gives us a negative change. It went down 842.32. And then I take that change divided by not the current period, but the prior period. So divided by the 2042.32. So that gives me a 41.19% decrease. Now that's important to note because if you talk about any kind of like measuring tool, measuring performance, for example, baseball players having a performance of how well they play the game measured in terms of their percent increases and decreases, right, in their statistics for hitting and pitching and so on and so forth. Similarly, stock market changes and changes in other job performances are often framed in percent increases and decreases. So how do you get there? Current period less the prior period, that difference divided by not the current period, but the prior period, giving you that percentage change. All right, so then we can also do some formatting here. So now maybe I don't want this title in here. Maybe I want the negative numbers to be bracketed, for example. So in that case, I might go to the customization of the reports. And maybe I want to say that I want to see negative numbers to be bracketed and maybe red. And maybe I don't want the pennies without cents. And then possibly on the header, I want to see the report period, remove the report period. I don't want on the footer the date prepared, time prepared, and report basis. So I'm going to remove those and then OK. If I was in the other, and now you have the red here, no decimals, and so on and so forth. Notice that if you were in the other mode, if I switched to the modern mode, we did some of those adjustments, more of them being in the general options over here. So we said don't show zeros, we had that. And then round amounts to the nearest whole currency. That's the removing of the pennies. Negative numbers show red. And then on the header, we had the report period and the date prepared and time prepared. I've removed these, date prepared, time prepared, and we want to get the report period out of there, so it removes that item. And then I'll go OK. So there it is on that format. Let's go back to the classic view. So now we have, that's the general layout. So that's how we can do a comparative report. Just a quick look, if you had a different period on it, you might say, well, I want to do a comparative report for 1 month, for example. So we might take the last month, December, comparing it then to the prior month, November. So how would you do that? We'd go to the last month, 12/01/25 to 12/31, run it, and then the previous period is going to be, this is the prior year. So if I select the drop down, notice what it's taking here is the prior year at December, which is another way that we could compare it, right? I could say, let me see the December from this year to December of last year and see how I did at this time of year. That would be useful, of course, if we have a seasonal business in particular, where it's not as easy for me to compare December to November. It makes more sense for me to compare this December possibly to last December. But I could compare it to November by now going back up top and say I want to compare it to the previous period. Custom period is now the 11/1 to 11/30, noting that when I compare month to month, it's going to be a little bit more messy because some months have 31 days versus 28 days versus 30 days and so on. But I could still check off the dollar and percent change and then run it to refresh it. So now I've got the current period, December 31st, and the prior period, November 30th, and then the dollar change. In this case, there aren't any because all of the data was entered on 1 month, but that's the idea. And then you've got the percent change. What if I did this for November, 11/01/25 to 11/30/25? I think we have data. Now all of the data is in one period again. Well, most of the data is in 2024. What if I made this 2024 and 24? So we get some difference here, for crying out loud. There we have November versus October, and then we have the change and so on and so forth. Now, the other common period you would have is a quarter. So let's take the last quarter, which would be October, November, and December. So 10, let's say 10/31 or 10/01/25 to 12/31/25, let's say. And then we can compare the previous period, which is going to be 7/7/8/9, right? And so we have 7/1 to 7/9/25, and we'll say, okay, is there a comparative data in that? There's not really any comparative data in that in 2025, but you get the idea on a quarterly basis, and we could compare then to the prior quarter. So instead of doing it here, I might say I want to compare the same period to the prior year and run it that way. So let's run that. So now we're comparing, well, basically the last quarter is going to be as of the end of the year, 2025 to the end of the year of the prior year. Now, if we were on the income statement, which is a performance report, it would make a difference where the beginning date was on the performance reports. We'll do that more in future presentations. But just to get an idea of it, that means that there's a whole lot of combinations that you can get in play, especially with the performance reports when we start to do these comparisons. Just to list out a few of them, you could have a month-by-month report side by side with more than one period, right? You could have a quarter-by-quarter report in the current period. You could have all 4 quarters versus the last couple quarters. You could have a year-by-year comparison. And then you could have a 2-period comparison of all kinds of 2-period comparisons. This month compared to last month. This month of December compared to last December instead of the November. You can have this quarter compared to the prior quarter. You can have this quarter compared to the prior year of the same quarter. Quarter number 4 compared to the quarter number 4, and so on and so forth. So you can get quite overwhelmed in the number of reports that you can put together just with these comparisons. And what you want to do is try to think of what's your systematic grouping of reports you're going to batch together as you periodically give them to, say, your client, which is what I typically am framing the presentations from. We want to give them a package of our data. What are we going to give them on a package report that's going to be reported on a monthly basis versus a quarterly basis versus quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. Quarter 4 usually being more detailed because you need more information for year-end stuff, such as tax preparation and end-of-the-year financial statement, external reporting, and so on and so forth. We'll talk more about that in future presentations, but once you have the reports that you like, you might customize the reports or save customizations. And maybe this is a balance sheet for external reporting, let's say. You might add a group and say this is going to be for quarter or year-end, let's just say year-end reports or something. And then we'll add that to the group and save it so that when we make our reports at the end of the year, I can go to the first tab, refresh it. Let's refresh this thing. And then I'll go into the custom reports. And so now we have under the category of year-end reports, we've got our report here that's already formatted for us. And so then I can organize those. We might even come up with a numbering convention, which we might talk about in future presentations for that.